Have you ever heard of a man who ran faster than horses? It seems impossible, but this is the story of a biblical prophet who, with divine strength, accomplished a supernatural feat. But what motivated this incredible race? How was he able to outrun the horses in a time when speed was limited to the best animals and vehicles? Get ready to discover one of the most surprising stories in the Bible, a story that will challenge everything you know about faith, miracles, and the power of God. But before we dive in, I want to invite you to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications to receive more powerful messages like this one. The prophet Elijah, a simple man but deeply committed to his faith, became one of the greatest examples of how God can use anyone to accomplish extraordinary things. Born in a time of great apostasy, where many had turned to worship Baal, Elijah stood out as a firm voice against spiritual corruption. But what makes his story so impressive is the way God used him to perform miracles that defied human logic and undeniably revealed divine power. One of the most striking scenes in Elijah's life took place on Mount Carmel, when he challenged the 450 prophets of Baal in an epic confrontation. The challenge was simple. Both sides would prepare an altar and call on their God to send fire from heaven. The God of Israel, the God of Elijah, was the only one who would answer with fire. The battle seemed disproportionate, but Elijah had complete trust in the presence and power of the Lord. And as we know, that's exactly what happened. When Elijah prayed, the fire of God descended from heaven, consuming the altar completely and showing everyone clearly and undeniably that the God of Israel was the one true God. But what happened after this grand miracle is equally impressive. Instead of celebrating his victory, Elijah soon found himself pursued by the wrath of Queen Jezebel, who swore to kill him. What follows is a scene that many of us might not have imagined. Elijah, a man who had just challenged hundreds of prophets and witnessed the supernatural power of God in action, was now fleeing to save his life. But what makes his escape unique wasn't the fear, but the fact that on his journey to Jezreel, a city 30 kilometers away, Elijah wasn't just running. He was being propelled by a supernatural force. Can you imagine? A man running for an entire day, without stopping, without exhaustion, as though guided by a force beyond the natural. The Bible says that the Lord, in his mercy and power, enabled Elijah to run to Jezreel with a speed and endurance that defied human understanding. That race was not just physical, it was a manifestation of God's power, which became a transforming force in Elijah's body and mind. He wasn't just running away, he was being driven by something greater, something supernatural. And this leads us to reflect, how far can we go when God empowers us supernaturally? How far can our faith take us, turning the impossible into something extraordinary? Often, we find ourselves limited by our own capabilities and by what we consider natural barriers. But Elijah teaches us that when God is with us, those barriers disappear. The impossible becomes possible. What seemed to be just a physical race, a simple task, transforms into a demonstration of divine power that goes beyond human comprehension. Now, imagine if Elijah's story had ended there. But what comes next will surprise you even more. What happened after this miraculous race? What did God have prepared for Elijah, and how did he use this moment of great challenge to further shape the prophet's character? After this extraordinary experience, was Elijah still prepared for what was to come? If you believe that these teachings can transform lives, leave a like so more people can discover this truth. Imagine the scene. A man, exhausted after days of spiritual battle, yet with a heart filled with God's supernatural strength. Elijah, the prophet, knew his mission was vital. He needed to deliver an urgent message to King Ahab, who was on his way to Jezreel. The distance between them was vast, and Ahab was traveling in the utmost comfort in a horse-drawn chariot. But what happened next? Something absolutely astonishing. Elijah, without any natural explanation, began running with superhuman speed, overcoming all the obstacles ahead of him. Now understand the context. Elijah wasn't just running. He was on a divine mission. King Ahab was traveling in grand style, with his chariot pulled by horses. These animals were fast, trained to run long distances at great speed. Yet Elijah, an ordinary man, defied logic. When we see this, something beyond a mere run is revealed. What was happening? How did Elijah, a tired man with no physical preparation for such a feat, manage to outrun a whole team of horses? This was not just a run, but an act of faith manifested through a supernatural action. Here lies the crucial point of this moment. What does this run teach us? What can we learn from Elijah about trusting God, even in the toughest situations? Looking at this story, we see that the strength Elijah used was not his own. It didn't come from his tired body, but from his complete trust in God. He knew his mission was greater than any physical fatigue or natural barrier. He didn't focus on his limitations, but on the greatness of the divine promise that accompanied him. This episode invites us to reflect on the power of prayer and trust in God. Often, we find ourselves exhausted, feeling like we can't go on. The pressure is great, the obstacles seem immense, and the distance to our goal feels endless. But like Elijah, we need to remember that our strength doesn't lie in our human abilities, but in the divine strength that sustains us. And here's the key. When you place your trust in God, He can act supernaturally in your life, doing what seems impossible in human eyes. Elijah didn't run by his own strength, but by the divine energy that empowered him to achieve something beyond what any human could accomplish. And this brings a powerful lesson. Prayer is not just a religious practice. It is a powerful tool that activates God's power. In our lives, it is through prayer that we make space for Him to act, strengthening us when we need it the most. Now, if this story of trust and divine strength has got you thinking, you might be wondering, what else did Elijah do that demonstrated divine intervention in his life? Let's continue exploring what the life of this great prophet has to teach us about faith in action. The episode of Elijah running ahead of Ahab's chariot is more than just a simple act of speed. It is a profound reflection of God's divine power working in the lives of His chosen ones. When the Bible tells us that Elijah outran the horses, what does that truly mean? It wasn't just an impressive physical feat, but a supernatural act, a manifestation of God's power that transcends the laws of nature. The prophet, exhausted after a great victory over the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, found the strength to surpass time and space itself, something that, humanly speaking, would be impossible. Elijah's run reveals that when we are strengthened by God, our human limitations can be overcome. The feeling of helplessness in the face of adversity often prevents us from seeing what we are truly capable of achieving. Elijah wasn't simply running to reach a destination. He was walking with God, empowered by His supernatural strength. This leads us to reflect. How many times have we felt as though we were facing enormous obstacles, like insurmountable mountains, and couldn't see a way out? But Elijah's run challenges us to remember that, with divine help, we can not only face those difficulties, but also overcome them in ways that, by our own strength, would be unimaginable. When Elijah ran, he was literally breaking the physical barriers of what is possible for a human being. However, what he teaches us goes beyond speed or physical strength. Elijah's run is a powerful metaphor for the journey of faith. Often, life places us in situations where we feel as though we are fighting alone, where our resources seem insufficient, and where exhaustion takes over both body and soul. Yet just as God empowered Elijah, He is also willing to give us strength to face our battles. Elijah's run was not a race for personal glory, but a race in obedience to God, driven by the power of the Holy Spirit. With each step, he was fulfilling God's purpose, and in doing so, he demonstrated to the world how God can sustain us, even in the most difficult circumstances. When we think about what this means for our lives today, we might ask ourselves, where are our own horses and chariots? Where are the situations that seem beyond our strength, the obstacles that challenge us to keep going when everything within us screams to quit? Could it be that with God's help, we too can go beyond our own limits? Perhaps you are struggling with an illness, facing endless unemployment, or dealing with a family crisis. Like Elijah, you might be feeling that the battle is long and hard, but the message of this passage is clear. God is by your side, and he can give you the strength to keep going. Just as Elijah, with God's power, was able to go beyond what seemed possible, we, in our journey of faith, can achieve extraordinary results. It's not a race to prove our strength, but a walk with God that allows us to transcend our own limits. And when the run seems difficult, when exhaustion seems overwhelming, it is in those moments that we can remember that we are not alone. The same God who empowered Elijah to outrun the horses is also willing to empower you to face your challenges. But what if there was an even deeper aspect to this run? Something that reveals even more about how we can overcome the greatest obstacles in our lives. Did you know that every time you like a video like this, you are helping to spread the teachings of the Bible to more people? Subscribe to continue being part of this mission. At the most difficult moment of Elijah's life, he was alone, exhausted, and hopeless. He had fled to the desert, seeking to escape a mortal threat. Even in his human fragility, God manifested a supernatural strength, something that went beyond Elijah's natural abilities. This strength not only sustained him physically, but also renewed him spiritually. The journey he began with steps of despair turned into a journey of renewal when divine intervention became present. In the desert, in silence and solitude, God strengthened him like a compass pointing north, guiding him and preparing him for what was to come. Now, imagine for a moment what this means for our lives. Perhaps you've experienced times when you felt so drained, so vulnerable that you couldn't see a way out. Do you remember when you were on the edge of exhaustion, fear, and doubt, and suddenly something inside you reignited? It was as if an invisible force had entered your being, renewing your energy and restoring your courage to keep moving forward. That power, which sustained Elijah in his journey, is the same one available to you today. It is not a force reserved for ancient prophets, but a gift from God to all his children, regardless of time and circumstances. You might think, but is this really possible for me? Am I truly worthy of receiving this divine strength? The answer is simple, yes. God's power does not pick favorites. It does not judge by appearance or past. It is available to all who believe, who call upon his name in times of need. No matter how great the storm is or how dark the tunnel you find yourself in, there is a supernatural force that can sustain you, guide you, and above all, transform you. And you know, this power is not something you should expect to find only in extreme moments. It is available at every step of your journey. When you feel like you have no strength left, when fear and anxiety threaten to take over, remember that there is an infinite resource, a strength beyond what the eyes can see. By calling upon this divine strength, you are not only asking for relief, but for transformation. For when God gives us his strength, he doesn't just help us endure, he empowers us to overcome. This power is not something distant, unattainable, or abstract. It is real and tangible, available to all who have faith. The key is to recognize that by surrendering to God's will, the impossible becomes possible. The same God who sustained Elijah is ready to sustain you, no matter where you are or what you're facing. And this is where we begin to understand that true strength doesn't lie in our own limits, but in the infinite strength that God places within us. Now, imagine how your life would be if you started depending more on this supernatural strength instead of relying only on your own power. What would you be capable of accomplishing? Stay with us as we will continue to explore how true faith connects us directly with this source of divine power, enabling us to do things beyond our imagination. That day, the scene was one of a battle, but not just any battle. On one side, Ahab, the king of Israel, with all his pomp, his army, war chariots, and majestic horses. On the other side, Elijah, a simple man with a divine mission to fulfill. The great test was not just in the physical strength of each side, but in the essence of their trust and what they believed in. The race between Elijah and Ahab was not just a contest of speed, but a battle of faith, a question of who truly held authority and power. King Ahab, with all his military strength, believed that power was in his own hands. His army and chariot were symbols of control, a domain built through human strategies, wealth, and a personal will to impose himself upon the world. Ahab believed that his strength could overcome any obstacle. On the other hand, Elijah had no army, no chariots, and at first glance he seemed like the obvious loser. But he possessed something far more powerful, the strength of God. It was not the strength of his muscles or the speed of his legs that made him run, but the strength of the Lord that propelled him forward. Elijah's race was not just a demonstration of physical endurance, but a reflection of unwavering faith. What seemed impossible to human eyes, a simple man competing against such a powerful king, was in fact a clear reminder that God is in control. He is greater than any circumstance, stronger than any obstacle. Now think about this. How many times have you faced challenges that seemed impossible to overcome? Situations that at first glance appeared bigger than any human capability. How did you react to those challenges? Many of us, like Ahab, try to solve everything on our own, relying only on our own understanding and strength. But what we learn from Elijah is that by fully trusting in God, we can go beyond what we imagine possible. When we surrender to Him, we receive divine strength to face even the greatest challenges of life. It is important to understand that this race was not just about reaching a destination, but about the process. Elijah's journey to victory was a journey of faith, a journey of surrender. He could have looked at the obstacles and doubted, but he did not. He trusted that God would guide him. This leads us to reflect. How have you been handling the obstacles in your life? Are you trying to solve them with your own strength, or are you seeking the strength that comes from God? True victory, as we have seen, is not about who arrives first, but about who fully trusts in God. What seemed like a physical race was in fact a test of trust and unwavering faith in God's power. And in the end, God always fulfills His promise, as He did with Elijah, who by trusting in God surpassed even human limits and obtained victory. But what happened after this great test? How did God continue to demonstrate His power in surprising ways? Stay tuned, as we will see how Elijah, even after such a grand victory, had to face an even greater challenge that tested his faith in a profound way. Elijah was not just running. He was in a much deeper race, one that transcended the physical and ventured into the spiritual. He knew that his mission would not be accomplished by his human strength alone, but with an unshakable faith that was leading him to something much greater. Before taking any step, Elijah withdrew for a time of intense spiritual preparation. Through fervent prayer, fasting, and consecration, he was preparing to be the instrument through which God's miracle would manifest. His journey to Mount Carmel was not just a physical trip, but an inner journey of total surrender and dependence on God. Imagine, for a moment, the scene. The scorching heat of the desert, the dry and difficult terrain, and the promise of a great challenge ahead. But Elijah knew that his race was not for something fleeting. He wasn't just running to get closer to a place. He was running to align himself with God's purposes. He was spiritually preparing for a mission that would be pivotal, not only for him, but for the entire nation of Israel. Every step he took was an act of faith, a commitment to the divine plan. He knew that to witness the miracle, he needed more than physical strength. He needed to be completely surrendered to God's will. How many times in our own lives are we faced with great challenges without even thinking about preparing spiritually? Sometimes we become so focused on immediate solutions or human strategies that we neglect the power of solid spiritual preparation. Elijah teaches us that before any great action, we must ask ourselves, am I spiritually ready for what God wants to do in my life? The miracle does not come by chance, nor by pure luck. It is preceded by preparation that involves prayer, consecration, and a commitment to trust completely in God. In Elijah's journey, the secret lay in surrender. It wasn't just about what he was doing, but how he was surrendering to the divine plan without reservation. He didn't trust in his own strength to fulfill the mission, but in God who sustained him every step of the way. The lesson here is clear. If we want to see miracles in our lives, we need to prepare spiritually, surrender our will, and trust that God will do the impossible. Each one of us, in our own challenges, can learn from Elijah's stance. He shows us that often the greatest miracle lies in how we surrender to the process even before we see the transformation. So, I ask myself, are we preparing spiritually for the decisive moments in our lives in the right way? Amid daily challenges, our haste and worries often blind us to the importance of internal and deep preparation. As Elijah's story teaches us, true victory and miracles begin with surrender and the trust that God is in control and that He empowers us every step of the way. But what happens when someone doesn't prepare the right way? What can occur when we don't prioritize our faith and surrender? Elijah the prophet was always a man of unshakable faith, but what he did that day when he ran ahead of Ahab's horses was something that would leave anyone speechless. Ahab, a king used to relying on his military power and the strength of his army, would never have imagined that an ordinary man, with only the power of God by his side, could do what Elijah did. In a world of empire and glory, where the dominance of force seemed like the only path to success, Elijah appeared as a stark example of something greater, the sovereignty of God over all things. Imagine the scene. Ahab, mounted in his chariot, pulled by powerful horses, while Elijah, with no war equipment, runs ahead of him. The horses, with their athletic and swift bodies, try to catch up to the prophet, but they can't. Elijah, empowered by God, seems to overcome all human limitations, and Ahab, not knowing what to say or think, watches this scene of total reversal of expectations. The king, who believed human and military power would always be enough, now finds himself before a divine manifestation, something he could neither control nor fully understand. This moment was more than just a display of faith. It was a profound lesson, a clear demonstration that the Lord is sovereign over all things, including the limits of nature and human forces. The prophet in his run wasn't just racing to reach the destination faster, but was symbolically showing the king that God is in control of everything, and that human strength means nothing compared to divine power. What does this mean for us today? In a world where people often rely only on their abilities, their strength, or their strategies, Elijah's race reminds us that when God acts, the results can be far beyond what we imagine or expect. For Ahab, it was an awakening. He would need more than ever to reconsider everything he believed. Elijah, with his superhuman speed, not only challenged logic, but also the very expectations of the king. And as he witnessed this, Ahab was likely silent, absorbing what was before him. Did he realize the message God was trying to convey? Did he see, in that moment, that his reliance on military strength and the power of his horses was futile before a God who didn't need these things to show his glory? Elijah's race wasn't just physical. It was a race of revelation. It vividly and indisputably showed the king that God was greater than any army or human power. Now the real question is, in our own challenges and struggles, do we also recognize divine interventions? Do we see when God acts in our lives in ways that go beyond our understanding or ability to control? Ahab was forced to confront his own limitations and the need to recognize the sovereign power of God. And you, have you stopped to reflect on how God has acted in your life, often silently but profoundly, moving in ways that escape our human logic? What happens when our vision is expanded and we begin to see that what we deem impossible is perfectly possible when God enters the scene? This leads us to think, did Ahab, after this event, begin to see his kingdom differently? Did he come to understand what it truly means to trust in God and not in his own strength? And what would this mean for his future? After running faster than the horses themselves, Elijah did not slow down. His commitment to the divine mission was far from complete. He continued his journey with a heart full of purpose, knowing that his obedience to God would be what sustained him. But imagine for a moment what this means. Elijah had just experienced a great miracle, where he publicly proved that the God of Israel was the one true God before hundreds of false prophets. Yet instead of resting after this triumph, he faced a new battle, one more internal than any other. The physical exhaustion, the threats from Queen Jezebel, and the mental solitude could have been more than enough to turn him away from his calling. But he continued. And that is Elijah's great lesson. He did not stop, even when his strength seemed to fade. Elijah's perseverance is a trait that makes him a perfect model of faith in action. When everything around him seemed to crumble, he knew he wasn't relying solely on his own strength, but on divine direction. He was aware that God's plan for him went beyond what his eyes could see in that moment. We can learn from him that often the journey of faith is not about knowing exactly what comes next, but fully trusting that, even when we cannot see it, God is with us. This requires obedience and the courage to take the next step, even when we don't have all the answers. Elijah did not fully understand the whys of everything that was happening, but he knew what God had commanded him, and that was enough. When the challenges intensified, his obedience did not waver. This is where many of us face difficulties. How do we react when life tests us? Do we feel desperate, ask where God is, or fall into the temptation of stopping? But what if the secret isn't in seeking more strength, but in seeking more courage? Courage to keep going, even when the solution isn't in sight, trusting that just as God was with Elijah, he is also with us, guiding each step. It's interesting how, even amidst the exhaustion and pressure, Elijah was not alone. God's presence accompanied him, and the Holy Spirit strengthened him. Elijah's return to his calling is a reminder that when we obey God, he equips us, even in the most challenging situations. He never abandons us. He never leaves us to fight alone. Elijah's lesson is clear. Obedience is the key. And when we choose to follow him, he makes miracles happen in our favor. Now take a moment to think, what's going on in your life? What challenges have you been facing? Have you been obeying God, even when the direction doesn't seem clear? What do you think God is asking of you now in your walk? You might be waiting for a miracle to lighten your burden, but what you truly need is the courage to continue in obedience. Like Elijah, you are not alone on this journey. True strength comes from trusting God, and obedience to him is what opens the doors to the blessings he has for you. And now, if Elijah could speak directly to you, What would he say? Would he ask you to keep running or perhaps to wait a little longer? What did he understand about God's timing that could change your perspective? Stay with me, because this answer goes beyond what we can imagine. Elijah, exhausted, seemed to have reached the end of his journey. His feet could no longer match the strength his mind demanded. The race he had undertaken was not a mere test of physical endurance, but a deep reflection of God's power in his life. He had run without stopping, fleeing from despair, trying to escape the oppression of a life full of challenges. However, there, at his lowest point, he discovered something he had never imagined. God had never abandoned him. Elijah's story teaches us that often we face moments when physical and emotional exhaustion seem to take over. We find ourselves overwhelmed, with life's obstacles turning into insurmountable mountains. But what Elijah experienced, and perhaps what you have also felt, is that true strength doesn't come from within us, but from the trust we place in the Lord. When everything seems lost, when there's no energy left to continue, God works in unexpected and surprising ways, giving us strength beyond what we thought possible. And it was precisely in this surrender, in the unwavering trust, that Elijah's true victory happened. It wasn't just physical strength that pushed him forward, but God's power in his life. After receiving divine food and renewing his strength, Elijah was able to continue his journey. The race, which initially seemed impossible, turned into a spiritual marathon, where he not only ran, but triumphed. God's power was the fuel that allowed Elijah to go beyond what any human could imagine. He ran not just for miles, but overcame limits he himself thought were impassable. No matter how distant or difficult the goal seemed, God sustained him with every step, every breath. When Elijah received God's final message, he was no longer the man who doubted his own abilities. He was a living example of how faith can transform and empower someone to go beyond their own limits. Now, imagine yourself in Elijah's place. There's no denying that life's challenges can seem like a heavy burden. Every difficulty can feel like an impossible weight to carry, an endless race. But the lesson Elijah leaves us is clear. With God by our side, we are capable of doing extraordinary things. We don't have to rely on our own strength. Instead, we can surrender to His will and trust that He will empower us, just as He did with Elijah. When difficulties arise in your life and you feel exhausted, remember Elijah's story. He was able to go beyond, not by his own strength, but by the strength of the Lord. As you reflect on Elijah's journey, a question arises for you. How have you reacted in the face of difficulties? When obstacles rise before you, are you willing to trust fully in God? Remember, Elijah's race teaches us that God's power goes beyond what we can imagine. He can make us go farther, faster, and higher than we ever thought possible. When the next challenge comes, when shadows seem to threaten your path, do as Elijah did. Surrender to the Lord and let Him empower you to reach new heights. At the end of his journey, Elijah not only had his strength restored, but was led to a new understanding of divine power. He discovered that by trusting in God, he could overcome anything. He was no longer alone, and you are not alone either. God is by your side, ready to give you the strength needed to win life's battles. Like Elijah, you can do more than you ever thought possible. All you need to do is trust fully in God and allow Him to guide your steps. Just like Elijah, you too are in a race, a journey that requires perseverance, faith, and trust. And remember, you don't run alone. God is with you every step of the way, empowering you to overcome any obstacle. True strength comes from a heart that trusts and completely surrenders to Him. So, what did you think of Elijah's story and the incredible lesson it teaches us about trusting in God? If you felt touched and inspired by this message, don't forget to like, share it with someone who also needs to hear this, and of course subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more videos like this. Remember, with God, you are capable of going farther than you ever imagined. See you in the next video, and may God abundantly bless you.